I only have one message to give you. I don't care what you think of me. I don't care what you call me. I do care what you do with this information because it is important to our survival as a species.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story, obviously calling our sources and trying to figure out exactly what happened, but clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
Did you hear the explosion from
yes.
your position?
Yes, we did. As a matter of fact, we heard it, and because I was just like standing there pretty much looking out the window, I didn't see what caused it or if there was an impact.
So you have no idea right now?
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit. It hit another building.
We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. It would appear that there has been another major explosion, this one in the nation's capital.
A hijacked plane crashed in Pennsylvania this morning, not far from the West Virginia border. This is one of the 4 planes hijacked during this morning's attack. It crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
Behind me, you see burning 7 World Trade Center. I didn't know it at the beginning, at the tape you're about to see. I didn't know it was a 7 World Trade Center, but I know it now coming back. A 4-block radius has been cordoned off because fire officials expect that building to collapse.
Holy shit. What happened? Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
September 11th, 2001 was the single largest psychological operation ever perpetrated against the people of this world. It was the catalyst event ushering in a New World Order police state, erected on the ashes of our great republic. Since the events that day, we've witnessed a transformation of our society, not just in America, but globally. We've had our basic rights shaved down to nothing, with legislature like the Patriot Act. The Department of Homeland Security, which was created, supposedly in response to the attacks as a way to protect the American people, now considers the American people a threat to our nation's security. 20 years later, and no true criminals have ever been brought to justice, mostly due to the fact Israel was heavily involved in the planning and execution of the events, and we all know who owns our politicians. I'm not here to argue about whether the planes were real or not. I'm not here to argue about holograms and tactical nukes. I believe while research like that may be fun, to truly understand the events, you must understand who benefited from them, and in this documentary I intend to name names and connect the dots the best I can. So without further ado, let's start with the events that day. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower at 466 miles per hour between floors 93 and 99. There were 81 passengers on board and 11 crew members. At 9:02 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower at 590 miles an hour between floors 77 and 85. There were 56 passengers and 9 crew members aboard. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour on the western side. There were 58 passengers and 6 crew. 125 Pentagon personnel were also killed. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapses. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania at 583 miles per hour. There were 37 passengers and 7 crew members on board. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapses. At 5:21 p.m., Building 7 of the World Trade Center collapsed allegedly due to structural damage. Now, we all know Building 7 was a controlled demolition, as was clear by the way the building fell, and we also have the building's owner, Larry Silverstein, on camera saying he gave the order to pull it, which is a term in construction which means to demolish. There were also fires raging in the building, but nothing that would have taken it down naturally. Not to mention you had the BBC report its collapse before it had even fallen.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building. From here, we watched the building collapse.
With both the North and South Towers, you had numerous reports from first responders, witnesses, and news crews of multiple explosions before they fell. There were also reports of a car bomb that exploded outside of the State Department and that the building was on fire, but that was later nixed from the official narrative.
Senior law enforcement officials in Washington now tell us that a car bomb has exploded outside the State Department. That's it's a report now from the Associated Press, about to confirm it with our own people at the State Department, though everybody in Washington has been evacuated from their buildings. But a car bomb has now exploded outside the State Department. And John Miller, I see you writing quite frantically on something else.
We have just been told that what we thought was another explosion was indeed, according to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded. So it appears to be separate from the two that we have already witnessed this morning.
Seeing on your screen right now is live. This is not tape at all. This is the only remaining World Trade Center tower. The other collapsing not too long ago. Both victims of plane crashes. The tower rather that has collapsed, though we are told collapsed because of a third explosion. The source of that, though, at this point we don't know.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Roland Smith in the UPN 9 News studio. It is a sad and tragic day for America.
Indeed it is. I'm Brenda Blackman. The United Nations was hit by a series of terrorist attacks this morning, which left the World Trade Center destroyed and Washington under siege. The attacks began at 8:45 when a jetliner crashed into the World Trade Center. A second plane crashed into the Twin Towers about 15 minutes later. The crashes left fiery, gaping holes in the 110-story buildings.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed. After about 20 minutes later, the second tower also collapsed in flames.
Joining me is Jack Kelly. Now, he is a foreign correspondent, war correspondent, and just came back from Israel. He has some information about these attacks. Jack, what can you tell us happened first in New York?
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time two planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Yeah, hi. I am just about between 5 and 10 blocks north of the actual site of where those two towers have come down. We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard. The police are telling us they're either car bombs or they are simply cars that have overheated so much that they're exploding. But every time one of those happens, there's a flurry of activity, and there are more emergency vehicles that come down this road. I don't know if you can shoot past me and shoot down into that black cloud in there. That is the cloud that we were in just about 45 minutes ago or so. At the time we were there, when the first trade tower came down, my producer and I were overcome by the cloud of debris and smoke that came at us so rapidly. We had to break down a window to an apartment building. We had to break the window and go into the second door inside just to breathe. We were followed by a police officer and a security guard from the World Trade Center area. I want to show you something if I can. I'm just using a cell phone so that I can hear you because there are no cell lines that are coming out of Manhattan at the time. But see if you can zero in on this right here. This is the kind of debris that we're seeing all over the ground. If you can see the address, One World Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center.
Okay, obviously we're having some technical problems with Ashley Banfield, who is on the ground near the World Trade Center about 5 blocks away.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is still unconfirmed, but that is what the FBI is going on at this point.
Now, here in Washington, can you tell us what happened with this jet? We believe it's an American Airlines jet that was going from Dulles International Airport to Los Angeles. Can you tell us about that?
At approximately 9:45, the plane hit the side of the building over there. There are confirmed deaths at this point. This is thought to be part of a coordinated attack. This is the first time that U.S. officials will actually say that this is part of a coordinated attack, and I don't think it's exactly over yet.
It is not over yet.
They don't believe it's actually over yet. They're taking precautions. Within the last couple of minutes, the White House has approved sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, one into the Chesapeake Bay, the other outside of the New York City area, to prepare and defend for possible future attacks.
The passengers of Flight 93 supposedly fought back against the hijackers and crashed the plane as opposed to letting them hit another building, and are considered heroes, even though Rumsfeld is on camera saying it was shot down.
Have a sense, if we imagine the kind of world we would face if the people who bombed the Best Hall in Mosul, or the people who did the bombing in Spain, or the people who attacked the United States in New York, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the Pentagon.
20 years later, and we have yet to see footage of an actual plane hitting the Pentagon. FBI Special Agent Jacqueline McGuire testified that she examined 85 videotapes for 9/11 investigators and only found one which showed the impact of a plane. The other 84 were withheld from the public. Just one day before the events, Donald Rumsfeld, who can't seem to not incriminate himself on camera, gave a speech regarding Pentagon spending and a missing $2.3 trillion from the budget, which couldn't be accounted for, and boy did he have some choice words.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our leader, our Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld.
Pete Aldrich, Service Secretaries, distinguished officials of the Department of Defense, General Myers, thank you very much for those kind words. The topic today is an adversary that poses a threat, serious threat to the security of the United States of America. The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. Just as we must transform America's military capability to meet changing threats, we must transform the way the department works and what it works on. We must build a department where each of the dedicated people here can apply their immense talents to defend America, where they have the resources, information, and freedom to perform. Our challenge is to transform not just the way we deter and defend, but the way we conduct our daily business. Let's make no mistake. The modernization of the Department of Defense is a matter of some urgency. In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death, ultimately, every American's. A new idea ignored may be the next threat overlooked. A person employed in a redundant task is one who could be countering terrorism or nuclear proliferation. Every dollar squandered on waste is one denied to the warfighter. That's why we're here today, challenging us all to wage an all-out campaign to shift Pentagon's resources from bureaucracy to the battlefield, from tail to the tooth. We know the adversary, we know the threat, and with the same firmness of purpose that any effort against a determined adversary demands, we must get at it and stay at it. Some might ask, how in the world could the Secretary of Defense attack the Pentagon in front of its people? Some might ask, how in the world could the Secretary of Defense attack the Pentagon in front of its people? To them I reply, I have no desire to attack the Pentagon. I want to liberate it.
Liberate it he did. In fact, where the plane allegedly liberated the building was exactly where the records would have been kept regarding the $2.3 trillion, and many Pentagon employees killed that day were accountants and bookkeepers. There's also the matter of the dancing Israelis and art students who were detained that day and leading up to the events. In the first half of 2001 alone, there were over 130 reports from multiple federal agencies of, quote, Israeli art students penetrating secure facilities and even showing up to the houses of federal agents offering art for sale.
It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th. Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron has details in the first of a four-part series.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. There is no indication that the Israelis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 9/11 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Fox News has learned that one group of Israelis, spotted in North Carolina recently, is suspected of keeping an apartment in California to spy on a group of Arabs who the United States is also investigating for links to terrorism. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity.
Tonight, in the second of four reports on spying by Israelis in the U.S., we learn about an Israeli-based private communications company for whom a half dozen of those 60 detained suspects worked. American investigators fear information generated by this firm may have fallen into the wrong hands and had the effect of impeding the September 11th terror inquiry. Here's Carl Cameron's second report.
Fox News has learned that some American terrorism investigators fear certain suspects in the September 11th attacks may have managed to stay ahead of them by knowing who and when investigators are calling on the telephone. How? By obtaining and analyzing data that's generated every time someone in the U.S. makes a phone call.
What city and state, please?
Here's how the system works. Most directory assistance calls and virtually all call records and billing in the U.S. are done for the phone companies by Amdocs Limited, an Israeli-based private telecommunications company. Amdocs has contracts with the 25 biggest phone companies in America and more worldwide. The White House and other secure government phone lines are protected, but it is virtually impossible to make a call on normal phones without generating an Amdocs record of it. In recent years, the FBI and other government agencies have investigated Amdocs more than once. The firm has repeatedly and adamantly denied any security breaches or wrongdoing. But sources tell Fox News that in 1999, the super-secret National Security Agency, headquartered in northern Maryland, issued what's called a top-secret, sensitive, compartmentalized information report, TSSCI, warning that records of calls in the United States were getting into foreign hands, in Israel in particular. Investigators do not believe calls are being listened to, but the data about who's calling whom and when is plenty valuable in itself. An internal Amdocs memo to senior company executives suggests just how Amdocs generated call records could be used. Quote, widespread data mining techniques and algorithms, combining both the properties of the customer, like credit rating, and properties of the specific behavior such as whom the customers are calling. The Amdocs memo says the system should be used to prevent phone fraud, but U.S. counterintelligence analysts say it could also be used to spy through the phone system. Fox News has learned that the NSA has held numerous classified conferences to warn the FBI and CIA how Amdocs records could be used. At one NSA briefing, a diagram by the Argonne National Lab was used to show that if the phone records are not secure, major security breaches are possible. Another briefing document said, quote, it has become increasingly apparent that systems and networks are vulnerable. Such crimes always involve unauthorized persons or persons who exceed their authorization, acting on exploitable vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are growing because, according to another briefing, the U.S. relies too much on foreign companies like Amdocs for high-tech equipment and software. Quote, many factors have led to increased dependence on code developed overseas. We buy rather than train or develop solutions. U.S. intelligence does not believe the Israeli government is involved in a misuse of Amdocs information, and Amdocs insists that its data is secure. What U.S. government officials are worried about, however, is the possibility that Amdocs data could get into the wrong hands, particularly organized crime, and that would not be the first time that such a thing has happened. Fox News has documents of a 1997 drug trafficking case in Los Angeles in which telephone information, the types that Amdocs collects, was used to, quote, completely compromise the communications of the FBI, the Secret Service, the DEA, and the LAPD. And we'll have that and a lot more in the days ahead, Brett.
Israeli-based company called Amdocs that generates the computerized records and billing data for nearly every phone call made in America. As Carl Cameron reported, U.S. investigators digging into the 9/11 terrorist attacks fear that suspects may have been tipped off to what they were doing by information leaking out of Amdocs. In tonight's report, we learned that the concern about phone security extends to another company founded in Israel that provides the technology that the U.S. government uses for electronic eavesdropping. Here is Carl Cameron's third report.
The company is Comverse Infosys, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run private telecommunications firm with offices throughout the U.S. It provides wiretapping equipment for law enforcement. Here's how wiretapping works in the U.S. Every time you make a call, it passes through the nation's elaborate network of switchers and routers run by the phone companies. Custom computers and software made by companies like Comverse are tied into that network to intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls, and at the same time transmit them to investigators. The manufacturers have continuing access to the computers so they can service them and keep them free of glitches. This process was authorized by the 1994 Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. Senior government officials have now told Fox News that while CALEA made wiretapping easier, it has led to a system that is seriously vulnerable to compromise and may have undermined the whole wiretapping system. Indeed, Fox News has learned that Attorney General John Ashcroft and FBI Director Robert Mueller were both warned October 18th in a hand-delivered letter from 15 local, state, and federal law enforcement officials who complained that, quote, law enforcement's current electronic surveillance capabilities are less effective today than they were at the time CALEA was enacted. Converse insists the equipment it installs is secure, but the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Converse have in effect a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Converse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Converse is considered career suicide.
The dancing Israelis were 5 men apprehended that day, all of which had Israeli military backgrounds, and 2 of which were in federal databases of known foreign intelligence operatives. They claimed to work for an Urban Moving Systems, a moving company out of New Jersey, which was later proven to be a front for the Mossad. The owner of the company, Dominic Suter, fled the country soon after and has never been questioned. They were reported by multiple witnesses as having been seen dancing and celebrating after the first tower was hit, and were reportedly seen as early as 46 minutes prior to the attacks with cameras ready to go.
In the days after the September attacks, there were countless rumors about strange coincidences surrounding the events. One report about a group of Middle Eastern men spotted the morning of September 11th parked just across the river from New York City has not gone away. Investigation of their presence has led to questions about whether Israel was conducting espionage on U.S. soil. We're joined now by ABC's John Miller with an exclusive report this evening.
That's right, Elizabeth. This is a case that took the FBI and the CIA more than 2 months to sort out, while 5 Israelis waited in jail. It began when this woman was watching the Twin Towers burning from her apartment in New Jersey. She noticed 3 men on top of a van, posing for pictures with the towers burning in the background.
And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked. I thought it was very strange.
The witness called police, who stopped the van hours later and arrested 5 men. All 5, it turns out, were Israeli. They were turned over to the FBI. Sources tell ABC News during a check of national security databases, some of the men were listed as having had connections with Israeli intelligence. At the FBI, that set off alarm bells. The FBI needed the answers to 3 important questions. Who were these men? What brought them to that parking lot on the morning of September 11th? And did they have any advance knowledge of what was going to happen that day?
Incredibly, the work trucks they used for their company depicted a plane flying into the World Trade Center, which has been confirmed by police radio and witnesses, as well as the September 1st, 2003 report published by the Mineta Transportation Institute, which stated that there were continuing moments of alarm. A panel truck with a painting of a plane flying into the World Trade Center was stopped near the temporary command post.
The FBI has now put out a nationwide APB all points bulletin for a white Chevy van with New Jersey registration. Written on the back is Urban Moving Systems.
They're shooting. They're driving around shooting. They arrested 2 Iranians. Oh, they're shooting. I'm serious. It's like you should have saw me running.
I told you. Did you hear that they have they caught a bus, like a buck or a truck?
A van full of bombs, right?
Oh no! Somebody said there was a truck that had a picture of the World Trade Center with the plane flying into it. They caught it.
The plane got explosives on King and 6th Avenue. King on 6th Avenue Interstate. Police department car, one of those remote control planes filled with explosives. No one. Do we know it's in Broadway? N5, that plane. The campus in Broadway. CO, the air? 10-5, that plane message. 7-7 CO, Inspector Marino. Inspector Marino, go ahead. Thank you. Five, the message about the plane. Sergeant Miller, 7-5. About the plane. 10-5, the message about the plane. 9-4-1-4, hold up. 5, the message about the remote control plane. Station service on the air. 9-4-15, you on? Anybody advise the 10 stations operated? Bobby. Negative. Give an update on the plane. Spencer, I got a message on that plane. It's a big truck with a mural painted of an airplane diving into New York City and exploding. I don't know what's in the truck. The truck is in between 6th and 7th on King Street. All right, 10-4, I'll send the issue in the bomb squad there for West Cape. The first? Before the last message? That's fine. With a mural painted, airplane diving into New York, blowing up. 2 men got out of the truck, ran away from it. We got those 2 under. That's good. You got those? Are you holding those 2 guys, Kate?
The files released by the FBI are almost useless, as most information to this day is redacted and classified. The 5 men would later be released due to pressure from 2 unknown congressmen and criminal attorney Alan Dershowitz. They would later appear on Israeli television and deny that they are Mossad, but claim that they were there to, quote, document the event, which in and of itself demonstrates foreknowledge.
The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
Another peculiar example of foreknowledge by Israeli entities comes from the company Otago. It was reported that users of the Israeli messaging app received warnings as early as 2 hours before the first tower was hit that day. It's worth noting that Otago was purchased 8 months later by Converse Infosys, the Israeli company tasked with providing the equipment used for wiretapping by federal agencies. The founder of Converse Infosys, Kobe Alexander, would later flee the United States to southern Africa after he was charged by the DOJ with multiple counts of fraud. On Monday, April 14, 2003, Haaretz, which is the longest-running daily newspaper in Israel, published a story written by Yuval Dwor, and I quote, Otago, the instant messaging service, says that 2 of its workers received messages 2 hours before the Twin Towers attack on September 11th, predicting the attack would happen. And the company has been cooperating with Israeli and American law enforcement, including the FBI, in trying to find the original sender of the message predicting the attack. Mika Makover, CEO of the company, said the 2 workers received the messages and immediately after the terror attack informed the company's management, which immediately contacted the Israeli security services, which brought it to the FBI. I have no idea why the messages were sent to these 2 workers who don't know the sender. It may just have been someone who was joking and turned out they accidentally got it right. And I don't know if our information was useful in any of the arrests the FBI has made, said Makover. Otago is a US-based company whose headquarters are in New York with offices in Herzliya. As an instant messaging service, Otago users are not limited to sending messages only to people on their buddy list. As an instant messaging service, Otago users are not limited to sending messages only to people on their buddy list, as is the case with ICQ, the other well-known Israeli instant messaging application. Otago usually zealously protects the privacy of its registered users, said Makover, but in this case, the company took the initiative to provide to law enforcement services with the originating IP address of the message so the FBI could track down the internet service provider and the actual sender of the original message. Another Israeli company which had major involvement that day was ICTS. International Consultants on Targeted Security is the parent company of Huntley USA, who was in charge of airport screening security in Boston on 9/11. Huntley USA was a major defendant in the 9/11 tort litigation, as proven by court documents, and the parent company is located in the Netherlands but owned by Israelis. In fact, the federal judge in New York who oversaw the tort litigation was a man named Alvin Hellerstein, whose son Joseph worked for the ICTS as a lawyer in Israel. The company owner, director, and chairman is a man named Menachem Atzmon. His cousin Gilad Atzmon wrote in a book in 2011 called The Wandering Who, a study of Jewish identity politics, that Menachem was a frontman for Shaul Eisenberg. Shaul was a notorious Zionist and Mossad operative who supposedly died in China in 2007, although there are questions as to whether he faked his death. He was the founder of Israel Corporation, which is the largest holding company in Israel. He also owned Israeli company Atwell Security, who landed a contract with the New York Port Authority to do security for the Twin Towers. It was later terminated once it was established the company was tied to the Mossad. Atwell Security in America was represented by Peter Zvi Malkin, who was a member of the Israeli Haganah, which was the main paramilitary force in Israel until it later became the IDF. It's also worth noting that he was an explosives expert. He worked closely with Mossad operatives Raphael Eaton and Iser Harel. Raphael Eaton worked out of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s in charge of the Promise computer software alternation plot. They used Robert Maxwell, Mossad and MI6 double agent, father of Ghislaine Maxwell, to broker the deal for the software, which would siphon American nuclear secrets to Israel, who would then sell them to China. Iser Harel was known as the father of Israeli intelligence. He did an interview with Michael D. Evans on September 23, 1979, which was later talked about in an editorial published by the Jerusalem Post September 30, 2001, titled America the Target. Michael Evans said, and I quote, "I sat with former Mossad chief Iser Harel for a conversation about Arab terrorism. As he handed me a cup of hot tea and a plate of cookies, I asked him, 'Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?' Harel replied, 'You have the power to fight it, but not the will. They have the will, but not the power. All of that will change in time. Yes, I fear it will come to New York City, in your tallest building, which is a symbol of your fertility.' Either this man could see into the future, or he knew something we didn't."
I heard it repeatedly after the 93 World Trade Center bombing by saying they didn't kill enough people. It wasn't said by militants. It was said by FBI agents. They didn't say it because they wanted more blood, but they understood that it would take more blood in order to get the government to react. And now I'm hearing other FBI and other officials say to me, "Steve, we're going to need another 9/11.
On December 13, 2001, the State Department released a video they claimed was bin Laden taking responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. Many experts have examined the footage and claim that the translations were inaccurate, or outright creations of the translators themselves. Gernot Roter, who was a professor of Islamic and Arabic studies at the Asia-Africa Institute at the University of Hamburg, said at the time that the American translators who listened to the tapes and transcribed them apparently wrote a lot of things in them that they wanted to hear, but that cannot be heard on the tape, no matter how many times you listen to it. It is also worth noting that the man in the tape seemingly looks nothing like bin Laden. He has a much heavier build, a darker skin tone, and different nose. His voice in the video has also been called a passable imitation by experts. In a since archived article by the Washington Post published in 2010, written by Jeff Stein, he discusses how the CIA, quote, kicked around a number of ideas for discrediting Saddam Hussein in the eyes of his people. One was to create a video purporting to show the Iraqi dictator having sex with a teenage boy, according to two former CIA officials familiar with the project. Now this may seem unrelated, but it's important because in the same article Mr. Stein writes, and I quote, "The agency actually did a video purporting to show Osama bin Laden and his cronies sitting around a campfire swigging bottles of liquor and savoring their conquests with boys." One of the former CIA officers recalled, chuckling at his memory, that the actors were drawn from some of us darker-skinned employees. Now this begs the question, if the CIA could fake videos of bin Laden and supposedly never release them, could it be possible the videos released by the government themselves are in fact fake? It's not only the experts like Gernot Roter who doubt the credibility of the videos and translations, but even audio recordings said to have been made by bin Laden have also been questioned. In 2002, a study was commissioned by France 2 Television which analyzed voice recordings by bin Laden at the Dal Mali Institute for Perceptual Artificial Intelligence in Switzerland. The goal was to verify the authenticity of a voice recording allegedly made after 9/11 and delivered to Al Jazeera. Professor Hervé Bollard was in charge of the study and they tested 20 known recordings of bin Laden. They were able to identify his voice in all but one of the recordings with a less than 5% risk of error. They were unable to verify the authenticity of the recording.
Mr. President, in your speeches now, you rarely talk or mention Osama bin Laden. Why is that? Also, can you tell the American people if you have any more information, if you know if he is dead or alive? Final part here.
Yeah.
Deep in your heart, don't you truly believe that until you find out if he is dead or alive, you won't really eliminate the threat of...
Well, deep in my heart, I know the man's on the run if he's alive at all. And who knows if he's hiding in some cave or not. We hadn't heard from him in a long time. And the idea of focusing on one person is really indicates to me people don't understand the scope of the mission. Terror is bigger than one person. So I don't know where he is. Nor do I just don't spend that much time on him. Kelly, to be honest with you, I'm
It didn't seem Bush had much motivation to go after Osama, which isn't surprising seeing as his family has been in business with the bin Laden family as early as 1977. Mohammed bin Laden, the father of 54 children including Osama, emigrated from Yemen to Saudi Arabia before the First World War and established a construction company which soon gained the attention of the Saudi king, and he was awarded multiple contracts. Ironically enough, the same company was responsible for building airfields used by the United States military during Desert Storm. Mohammed died in 1967 and left his business to his oldest son, Salem. Most of the bin Laden children were educated in the U.S., and family regularly donated to charities and universities. In fact, the Bush and bin Laden families are so close that only 3 days after 9/11, his family members in the U.S. were escorted by the FBI to secret planes and flown out of the country for their protection, as reported by CBS News September 30th, 2001. In 1977, George W. Bush had a startup oil company named Arbusto Energy. The first investment into this startup was made by a man named James R. Bath for $50,000. It's widely believed this was made on behalf of Salem bin Laden and that Bath was a proxy financier for wealthy Saudis and others in the Middle East, including Khalid bin Mahfouz, major shareholder in BCCI, son of Salem, who founded the first private bank in Saudi Arabia. In 1976, Bath opened an aircraft brokerage firm, and some of the first investors included Khalid bin Mahfouz and Texas governor at the time, John Connally. A former business partner of James Bath was a man named Bill White, a real estate developer who had gone on the record stating that Bath is nothing more than a front man for the CIA, appointed by George H.W. Bush when he was CIA director, so they could move drugs, money, and weapons between Texas and the Middle East. Bath denies any claim that he was a CIA agent, even though records show he was a nobody Texas businessman with connections to some of the wealthiest Saudis in the world. BCCI, or the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, was formed in 1972 by a Pakistani financier named Aga Hassan Abidi. This was done primarily to launder money from the illicit sale of drugs and weapons for intelligence agencies and governments. It was one of the largest banks in the world at the time, with ties to the Queen of England, the Rothschilds, and George Soros. It operated out of secrecy and was often called a slush fund for the CIA. On October 10, 2001, a French intelligence report was released which claimed that the financial network of Osama bin Laden, as well as his network of investments, is similar to the network put in place in the 1980s by BCCI for its fraudulent operations, often with the same people. A senior U.S. investigator will later say that U.S. agencies are looking into the ties outlined by the French because they, quote, just make so much sense, and so few people from BCCI ever went to jail. BCCI was the mother and father of terrorist financing operations. It's also worth noting that Rudy Giuliani was in charge of the investigation into BCCI during his time as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The investigation was stalled during this time, and when he left his position, he began to work for White & Case, the law firm representing BCCI. In 1992, after the bank was shut down, there was a congressional investigation done showing that over 700 tips about the bank were ignored. Congressman Chuck Schumer, who led the investigation, said, "At the very least, there was nobody putting together all the pieces. You could make a credible case that somebody told them not to do anything about BCCI."
Garrick, for 20 years, Kamala Dam has been the man to see in Saudi Arabia for banking business, for weapons business, for intelligence business. This is a man who was head of the Saudi secret intelligence, the equivalent to the CIA. And from the beginning, he was a powerful force behind BCCI.
Not just in intelligence, but in our foreign policy, the Camp David negotiations in the 1970s.
Working the story, you find out that at the last minute, after President Carter had arranged Camp David, Sadat and Begin, Sadat began to have cold feet. He wanted a clear signal from the Arab world that it was okay for him to go ahead and do this. And what we understand is it was Kamal Adam who gave Sadat that clear signal and gave President Carter Camp David.
So they were right at the center not only of intelligence matters, but foreign policy negotiations. What else do we know about Adam, Brian?
What's so intriguing about him is that he shows up really wherever BCCI is in the deepest controversy. He was a business partner, for instance, of the man who was one of the biggest cable TV executives in the United States. What was known as Capcom. This was the commodities trading arm of BCCI, based in London. And Kamal Adam and Robert Magnus of Denver end up as sort of founding stockholders of this operation that turns out to be under indictment, a corrupt operation. When he gets in very big trouble, he has a number of lawyers in Washington. He hires an additional lawyer, a young man on the staff of the White House, John Sununu's executive assistant, a man by the name of Ed Rogers. He pays him $600,000. We're not sure for what. But it was at this point where the Justice Department came under intense pressure because in dealing with Kamal Adam, they found that one of John Sununu's former deputies was, in effect, his lawyer trying to broker things. And it raised questions about what are they trying to hide? What does this man know that they don't want to come out?
So what we're hearing is BCCI is closed, but the BCCI lobby is alive and well in Washington. And the principal objective right now seems to be to shut down this investigation before it reaches Kamal Adam, the Saudi connection, and the Saudi connection to other banks in the United States.
He's a man who knows too much?
Possibly. And the question is does he know too much to be prosecuted?
Now, obviously a big influence in the Arab world, being the former head of Saudi intelligence, but there's also an Israeli aspect here, isn't there, with the intelligence services?
What we're hearing from BCCI insiders is that BCCI was a catalyst and Kamal Adam a major player in secret cooperation between the Saudi intelligence service and Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, that's possibly gone on for 12, 13 years. And that these two groups were important in supplying the Afghan rebels. So it was Saudi intelligence, CIA, Israelis, Saudis, in an area that we don't know much about, what went on in Pakistan to supply the Afghan rebels.
Oh, right. We know this fellow Adam, but coming back to Abedi, the man who started all of this, where is he today?
Today he is the victim of a stroke at his home in Pakistan. He is said to be impaired, with his wife perhaps running things for him. On the other hand, we've heard reports he may try to open a new bank. But at the moment, as best we know, he is...
and out of reach of the law.
Out of reach of the American law, unlikely to ever be extradited to this country, even though he is now a wanted man.
All right. So now we are seeing the dimensions of what BCCI was doing, the audacity of it all, and we'll continue.
BCCI operated in this country behind a fabulous facade. This mansion in Georgia, a glittering office tower in Miami, ocean-going yachts, a fake billionaire frontman, smiles, connections, good times, and money. Millions to buy friends and influence for a bank that turned out to be a worldwide criminal enterprise.
This BCCI banker, in a conversation secretly recorded by the government, bragged about BCCI's hidden ownership of the first American bank in Washington, D.C., and about the power of lawyer Clark Clifford.
We own a bank based in Washington called the First American Bank. Clark Clifford is sort of the godfather of the Democratic Party.
There it was, a smoking gun in the investigation. But for some reason, the Justice Department did not move on the disclosure.
In 1976, BCCI established operations in Geneva, Switzerland by purchasing 85% of Banque de Commerce. The other 15% was retained by Thesaurus Continental Securities Corporation, which was owned by the Union Bank of Switzerland. A man by the name of Alfred Hartmann was president of Rothschild Bank AG of Zurich at the time, as well as a member of the board of directors for NM Rothschild & Sons in London. Bush would later change the name Arbusto Energy to Bush Exploration when his father became vice president. It was then merged with Spectrum 7 Energy Corporation, and Bush Jr. got nearly 14% of the parent stock in that company. It merged again with Harkin Energy in 1986, and in 1990 Harkin was given a contract by the Bahrainian government to drill for oil, even though the company was not experienced or even the best candidate for the job. The project was abandoned after no oil was found, and Bush sold his shares at a profit of nearly $900,000 2 months before Iraq invaded Kuwait. It's also a little-known fact that George Soros was a major shareholder at Harken Energy through his Quantum group of funds, which are private hedge funds based in London, New York, the Netherlands, and the Cayman Islands. It's also public knowledge that the Rothschild family invested $6 million into the Quantum Group in 1973. Also, when George H.W. Bush was vice president, he directed Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to sell weapons to the Iranian government during an arms embargo, which became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Oliver North opened up 4 bank accounts with British arms dealer Leslie Aspin at the French branch of BCCI. Drug money was funneled through this branch in order to fund the Contras, who were battling the Nicaraguan government at the time and whose efforts Reagan was sympathetic to. $42 million worth of weapons were arranged to be sold to Iran through Israel by Syrian drug and arms dealer Mansour al-Qassar in coordination with Oliver North and Leslie Aspin, who then laundered the money through the Cayman Islands branch of BCCI. During the 70s and 80s, the Soviets were making a killing from the opium trade in Afghanistan. The CIA also sold opium to fund a secret war in Laos in the 60s and 70s, but this came from the Golden Triangle opium region of Southeast Asia, while the Soviets got theirs from the Golden Crescent region of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. The United States was fighting for dominance in that region so as to control the money produced from the sale of heroin. They organized and trained the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors, to battle the Soviets in Afghanistan. The groups later became known as the Taliban, Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden became a CIA agent during the early 80s due to his wealth and connections to the Bush family. He was trained and armed by the agency in order to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan for control of the opium production. In 1989, when the Soviets left, it created a vacuum and different Mujahideen groups fought for control, throwing the country into chaos. The Pakistani government also fell into disarray the year prior when President Mohammad Zia died in a plane crash along with his top generals. Benazir Bhutto became prime minister that year and cracked down on the Pakistani intelligence service involvement in the drug trade. Arrests were made, including the vice president of Habib Bank, Hamid Hussain, but were all overturned when the new president of Pakistan, Ghulam Khan, got elected. He was the former finance minister of the previous administration and liaison to BCCI, as well as serving as the president of the BCCI Foundation, which was a fake charity that paid bribes and laundered money, not unlike the Clinton Foundation does today. Benazir Bhutto was later assassinated in 2007 by supposed al-Qaeda operatives. The Rothschild family controls the entire financial system. It could be said that they dictate what money is. They got their wealth by intermarrying with existing banking families starting in 1757, when Mayer Amschel Rothschild apprenticed under Jacob Wolf Oppenheimer, grandson of Samuel Oppenheimer, an Ashkenazi Jewish banker in Vienna. Mayer had 5 sons who spread out across Europe and Asia, establishing banking houses. Probably the most cutthroat of his sons would be Nathan, who set up shop in England, quickly entering the London Stock Exchange in 1804. When Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Nathan got news 2 days prior to the Duke of Wellington, whose armies he was funding with gold and silver. He had a complex system of couriers, ships, and messenger pigeons, which allowed him to receive news before most people. He went to the London Stock Exchange that morning and began selling his shares, prompting others to do the same, fearing that Napoleon had won. He then bought up most of the stock market for pennies on the dollar, becoming the wealthiest man in the world virtually overnight. The family can be traced back to the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany in 1577, but in reality the family represents only the most recent hierarchy in a system of usury, which goes back to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD during the First Jewish-Roman War. Zionism is a nationalist ideological movement which desires to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. It's been extensively documented that Israel as we know it today was formed due to the influence and wealth of the Rothschild family. Michael Chertoff's mother, Livia Eisen, was the first hostess for El Al, Israel's now national airline, and it's likely she was Mossad, as she was also friends with Isser Harel. This is important to note because Michael Chertoff was appointed by Bush to head the DOJ Criminal Division, which put him in charge of the 9/11 investigation for the first 2 years. He was also the co-author of the Patriot Act and appointed Second Secretary of Homeland Security. He would later leave government and make millions in the private sector doing risk consulting. She helped bring 45,000 Jews into Palestine between 1949 and 1950 during Operation On Wings of Eagles. A good book on the subject would be Rothschild and Early Jewish Colonization in Palestine by Rand Aronson. They had long expressed the sentiment to colonize, and when the British government announced support for establishing a home for the Jewish people in 1917, that became historical fact. In what is now known as the Balfour Declaration, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild where it said the following: "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It's been clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." The scope of this documentary is limited to 9/11, but in order to understand the events of that day, it's important to understand the larger picture. Most, if not all, key players in the events of that day, and those leading up to it, are Zionists, or agents acting on behalf of the Rothschilds, including George W. Bush, Jules Kroll, Larry Silverstein, and Ronald Lauder, to name a few. In 1991, a man by the name of Louis Freeh was promoted by George H.W. Bush to be the U.S. District Court Judge for the Southern District of New York. He became FBI Director 2 years later. Special Agent Robert Wright Jr. of the FBI was working in the Chicago division at the time, investigating money laundering and terrorists connected to the Middle East in a project known as Vulgar Betrayal. He accused Mr. Freeh of obstructing his investigations into financing of al-Qaeda. He wrote a book which the FBI prevented him from publishing. 3 months before the events of 9/11, he said this: "Knowing what I know, I can confidently say that until the investigative responsibilities for terrorism are removed from the FBI, I will not feel safe. The FBI has proven for the past decade it cannot identify and prevent acts of terrorism against the United States and its citizens at home and abroad. Even worse, there is virtually no effort on the part of the FBI's International Terrorism Unit to neutralize known and suspected terrorists residing in the United States." Mr. Freeh stepped down as FBI Director in 2001 and was replaced by Robert Mueller, who previously oversaw the BCCI investigation as he was in charge of the Justice Department's Criminal Division. Jules Kroll formed Kroll Associates in 1972 as a corporate investigations and risk consulting firm out of New York City. He previously served as Assistant DA for New York County and was in charge of overseeing security revamps to the World Trade Center after the 1993 bombing. Mr. Kroll's firm had some of the most powerful governments and organizations in the world as his clients, and he was known as the CIA of Wall Street, as most of his employees were former CIA and FBI agents. He was a member of the Quill and Dagger Secret Society, which also included Sandy Berger, a national security advisor to George W. Bush, and Stephen Friedman, Bush's top economic advisor. In 1993, AIG bought 23% of Kroll Associates. 2 years later, the son of AIG CEO Maurice Greenberg became CEO of Marsh & McLennan, who had offices in the North Tower. It's important to note that prior to 9/11, Kroll had begun consulting and working with AIG on issues involving security with the buildings. In February 2000, AIG created a venture team with Blackstone Group and Kissinger Associates. Jacob Rothschild is a member of the advisory board to Blackstone, and Henry Kissinger is a known war criminal puppet of the Rothschilds who was appointed ironically by President George W. Bush to the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, which is another name for the 9/11 Commission, and he actually stepped down from the investigation due to conflicts of interest. It's also important to note that Maurice Greenberg was a member of both the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations, as well as director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1988 to 1995, and served as its chairman from 1994 to 1995. In January 2001, Mr. Kroll hired Jerome Hauer as the head of his crisis management group at Kroll Associates. Mr. Hauer previously worked for Giuliani when he was mayor of New York and left his position to work for Kroll. Giuliani directed Mr. Hauer to establish a new emergency command center to replace the outdated police one. He built it on the 23rd floor of Building 7 and spent $13 million on the project. Mr. Hauer is an admitted Zionist, as well as his parents Milton and Rose, who immigrated allegedly from Israel. It's suspected that the Crisis Center was the control center for the detonation of the Twin Towers that day. The Crisis Center was constructed as a reinforced bunker which was blast-proof. On 9/11, the Crisis Center was operating out of Pier 92 because Giuliani said they needed more room as the next day FEMA was doing a biochemical attack drill.
We have here with us a man who should know whether or not it's working, Jerry Hauer, who's the former head of New York City Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, and the last time I saw you was in that place on the west side of Manhattan, which you had designed for just an event, or maybe an event not just like this.
Yeah, this certainly is an incredible event, Peter. I don't think in our wildest imagination you could think about a day where simultaneous attacks, you know, we all think about it, we plan for it, but to have something like this occur is certainly, I view it as an attack on our nation.
But was it? I understand your emotional state. I'd like
Sure.
everybody's the same. I think we're all the same.
Sure.
Did you never consider that this was a possibility?
Well, we consider, and as we plan for New York City, we plan for massive events. In point of fact, one of the things that we did when I was still heading up OEM was we put in place memorandums of understanding with New Jersey, with Connecticut, Nassau, Suffolk County, to ensure that there was enough medical care available, that we had ambulances, police, firefighters, because we had to plan for horrific types of events. And as I told you when you were down, we planned for various types of incidents, chemical and biological types of attacks, for explosive types of attacks. You know, this is clearly just a devastating type of an incident here in the city.
The Office of Emergency Management office, that bunker, it's a pretty elegant bunker, and nor is it underground. It was second and third floors,
Right.
I think. That's out of operation at the moment.
Yeah, my understanding
That's
is...
something you never planned for.
Yeah, well, in fact, we did. The alternate was to go to police headquarters or to another location in the event that the command center was inactivated for some reason or rendered useless.
Do you know what has happened to it today? Do you know precisely what's happened to it?
I talked to some folks down there, and my understanding is that a lot of the debris has fallen and has blocked the access to the building. I've heard some reports that they're concerned about the structural stability of the building, but I have not been able to confirm that.
In May 2002, Hauer was appointed by President Bush to be the acting secretary for the Office of Public Health. Unbelievably, in 2004, Kroll Associates was purchased by Marsh & McLennan, the very same group who had offices in the exact location the plane hit the North Tower. On July 24, 2001, less than 2 months prior to 9/11, Larry Silverstein finalized his lease of the Twin Towers from the New York Port Authority with his business partner Frank Louis, a Zionist. Louis founded and chairs the Westfield Group, the largest retail property group by equity market capitalization, and is rarely mentioned when discussing 9/11. Larry could not have done this without help from his fellow Zionist Ronald Lauder, who headed the two commissions under New York Governor George Pataki that pushed for the privatization of the World Trade Center, the New York State Commission of Privatization and the New York State Research Council on Privatization. It's theorized that the buildings were strategically fitted with explosives, which would not have been possible unless it was privatized, and with Kroll in charge of security for the Twin Towers, it all fell into place. Mr. Lauder is a very well-connected man and heir to the Estee Lauder Company. He has served in Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate as well as the Department of Defense in the 80s. He is president of the World Jewish Congress, of which David de Rothschild is the chairman of the governing board, and Jacob Rothschild is a member as well. George W. Bush also appointed him to serve on the honorary delegation, which visited Jerusalem to celebrate Israel's 60th anniversary in 2008. His daughter Jane married Kevin Warsh, who was on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and also a steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. Larry Silverstein met an FBI agent named John O'Neill through Jules Kroll and Jerome Hauer, and he hired him to run security. O'Neill was involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing investigation, as well as the investigation of the Oklahoma City bombing and most attacks ever attributed to al-Qaeda. Conveniently, he was working in the World Trade Center at the time and was killed in the events. Silverstein had a near $800 million debt from money he borrowed to complete the lease, and he made $4.5 billion after the attacks and insurance payouts. Frank Louis, co-owner, also leased 427,000 square feet of retail space in the complex, of course neither of which was ever charged or considered a suspect in what just might be the most obvious insurance fraud case in the history of mankind. It should be noted that Donald Trump, who would later become president, has said on the record that he's friends with Silverstein and he's a great guy.
The developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon him, Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.
It should also be noted that both Donald and his brother Robert were informants at one point for the FBI. Robert was providing information about BCCI, while Donald was helping take out mob bosses in Atlantic City, New Jersey. When Donald Trump went bankrupt with his casino there, he was bailed out by the Rothschilds via Wilbur Ross, who at the time was running the bankruptcy restructuring practice at N.M. Rothschild & Sons. He later appointed Ross as the 39th Secretary of Commerce when he became president. Before marrying Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's daughter Ivanka dated Nate Rothschild, as reported by Zoe Brennan in 2007 for the Daily Mail. Jared Kushner was also allied with Ross in investment properties. Giuliani was also Trump's lawyer recently. Things just come full circle, don't they? Because it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, as long as you're a Zionist. And you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. Just ask our newly installed puppet-in-chief, Joe Biden.
You know, I used to say, early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
There were 19 hijackers that hijacked these large planes that were filled with fuel bound for California that they used as missiles to destroy our country.
This is high school history class.
We lost 3,000 people. That included police officers, firefighters. It included the passengers on the aircraft. And it was a very devastating time.
And that's Patty Fantasian, the acting deputy in charge of Homeland Security's TSA investigation unit. Her lesson today, vitally important to educating the next generation.
Of kids that were not born before 9/11, but they're learning about 9/11. And I can tell you as a teacher, it's very different between the two. And you didn't have to teach the years after how many planes there were, or what was hit, who was responsible, that sort of thing. And it's no fault of theirs. They weren't there for it.
It just feels like another part of the wars that we've learned about because I wasn't alive for it or there for it. I've just heard so many stories, but you don't actually comprehend it.
This class aims to change that.
That was a very tragic day for our country. 8:45 a.m. on 9/11. Okay?
She not only explains the attack, but how it changed our country.
There were only 33 air marshals. There were only 33 air marshals. There were only 33 air marshals the day before 9/11 happened that flew only international missions.
And our way of travel.
Federal Air Marshal Service, where they hired approximately 3,000 federal air marshals to fly domestic and international flights.
The next generation of Americans learning about one of our country's darkest days from someone who experienced it.
When you teach them this is what was happening before and this is what's happening after, they start making connections. Oh, that's why the president does this. That's why the airport's like this. It makes history more relevant to the kids.
Christine Noel, KPRC Channel 2 News.
But Selby thinks taking the time to do a whole class on the attacks is important, especially as kids have fewer memories of their own about them.
I think it's one of the most tragic events we've ever had in our nation's history, so I think they need to understand what happened, the impact it had on not just New York City, but the whole nation and the world, and how it's changed things. That's one thing they don't realize how things have changed. And then when we cover the amendments later in the year, they don't realize how things have changed. And then when we cover the amendments later in the year, we talk about the Fourth Amendment, then it can be tied back in to a lot of the security measures that we have now that we didn't have before.
For most of this year's college freshmen, the 9/11 terrorist attacks aren't a memory, they're history. Some students in grade school may be hearing about it for the first time today. Fox 47's Kylie Kahn takes a look at how lesson plans are changing.
But many of those in college today don't have a vivid memory of 9/11, like Sevion Jones, who was just a year old in 2001.
The first time I remember hearing about 9/11 was, I believe, in 3rd grade.
That's where people like Lauren Reed come in. She teaches history at Grand Ledge High School.
Their perspectives are still individual because they're going off what they know from their parents and relatives or anyone in their family that served as a first responder.
My mom taught me, or told me about when it happened, her sitting on the couch watching TV and her just being so emotionally distressed about it.
Even though they may not have been alive at the time, the events from 9/11 still affect young people today.
I know when I go to the airport, I'm like, this is extremely strict, but I understand just to keep everyone safe. I totally agree and I just comply with everything. I totally agree and I just comply with everything. I totally agree and I just comply with everything.
I totally agree and I just comply with everything.
How do you teach our nation's most horrific memory to those who only know a post 9/11 world? They know the world is different now because of 9/11.
It's a lot safer than what it was before.
During the moment of silences, especially when you're when you're so young, a lot of people kind of just do it because they're told to, not necessarily because they understand what they're doing it for or because they have sympathetic connections to what happened.
So everybody is practicing, and of course you've heard that saying, if you see something, say something. That means that if something just doesn't seem right, let a grown-up know, because the grown-ups are there to keep you safe. For the grown-ups who might be listening, I go into this in more detail in my book called Please Explain Terrorism to Me, A Story for Children and Pearls of Wisdom for Parents. Please take a look at it because the back of the book will help you with some pointers about how to guide this kind of conversation and other difficult conversations with your kids. But mostly, kids, we want you to know that the grown-ups will do the worrying for you. We just want you to have fun and just be a kid. Thanks for watching.
Almost 20 years ago have passed since that day, and things have only gotten worse. Not only can you forget about boarding a plane without being molested, soon you won't be able to enter a store unless you've had a vaccination passport. Long gone are the days of free speech. The sitting president of the United States isn't even allowed to address his own people unless approved by big tech. The United States Capitol looks like something out of a movie, and we have a literal evil genius trying to take over the world. The youth in this country looked to us for guidance, and we failed them. They were born into a world that they didn't ask for, built by our own apathy and indifference. They're entirely separated from the event, and yet it still affects their everyday lives. They're the future of this country, and without them we have no chance. We need to go back to what made this country great, the Constitution and the rule of law. If we don't do that, then I'm afraid we've already lost. With this documentary, I hope to show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. The reason I focus on Zionism is because it's one of the strongest tools at their disposal. The financial elite will hide themselves behind the shield of anti-Semitism and use emotional manipulation and gaslighting to avoid discussion. Their belief system is an ancient one, and it's ultimately about power. Whoever these people worship, it definitely isn't the God of Abraham. The Israeli lobby and influence in our government is the largest of any group by far. We give billions every year to Israel, even when they are the biggest perpetrators of espionage against us. It's important to remember that it isn't the Israeli people or Jewish people who are the enemy. It's those who call themselves Jews but are not. This documentary represents more than 20 years of work from countless researchers, witnesses, authors, and whistleblowers. It would be impossible for me to list every connection or individual, but I hope you now have a better understanding of the events that day.